Reading again from A Strategy, A History by Lawrence Freedman, Oxford University Press, 2013. Operational Art. Maneuver displaced attrition remarkably quickly. This all took place within a Cold War context in which the enemy was both well-known and substantial, and the problem to be solved was deterring and, if necessary, resisting aggression across the inner German border. The focus was therefore on a classic great power confrontation between large armies in the center of Europe. It was one which made it possible to draw on the classic text of military strategy, updated for the information age. Edward Luttwak, a Romanian-born polymath with an unerring eye for a controversial argument, synthesized the various strands of critical thinking around U.S. military policy with a series of articles and books. He challenged the Department of Defense's bloated command structures and fascination with weapons procurement at the expense of strategic thought. Military strategy, he argued, required different ways of thinking than did normal civilian life. The interaction of opposing forces meant that war was a realm pervaded by a paradoxical logic of its own, standing against the ordinary linear logic by which we live in other spheres of our life. This normal logic was violated by inducing the coming together and even the reversal of opposites. As a result, paradoxical conduct tended to be rewarded while straightforwardly logical action was confounded, yielding results ironical if not lethally self-damaging. Those who understood how to manage the large civilian bureaucracies presiding over the armed forces could not therefore grasp a strategy because it involved a quite different way of thinking. They would look for standardized solutions, failing to understand how much easier this made the enemy's task. Luttwak also acknowledged that even if national leaders somehow acquired this paradoxical turn of mind, they might not dare display it lest they alarm their constituents and colleagues. Any deviation from the commonsensical conventions of the time and place would risk a loss of authority. The linear planning model, which Robert McNamara had taken to the Pentagon, was flawed precisely because it could not anticipate everything and so was likely to produce perverse outcomes. This led Luttwak into arguing, in effect, for confusion or at least against attempted coherence, for only policies that are seemingly contradictory can circumvent the self-defeating effect of the paradoxical logic. Luttwak overdid his point. War did not require different logic, just a recognition of a different context, one in which it would make perfect sense to follow a different path to one followed in peace. Luttwak focused attention on the importance of what he identified as the operational level. This had been neglected, and with it the classical traditions of European war. Jomini, Liddell Hart, and John Boyd had referred to this level as one for grand tactics. Jomini described these as the maneuvering of an army upon the battlefield and the different formation of troops for attack. Luttwak believed that the operational level was the critical sphere for generalship, and for that reason deplored its absence in contemporary American military thought. It was there that, quote, schemes of warfare such as blitzkrieg or defense in depth evolve or are exploited, end quote. Americans had neglected this because of their dependence on an attrition style of war. The idea of an operational level of war as a politics-free zone where commanders could demonstrate their mastery of managing large forces over wide areas in a series of complex engagements with the enemy was an inheritance from von Moltke. It was given added salience because of its prominence in Soviet military thought. From the formation of the Soviet Union, its military leadership had been engaged in theoretical debates about the operational level as an intermediate stage between tactics and strategy, and which way they should turn when faced with the choice between decisive annihilation or more defensive attrition. In the build-up to the Second World War, Marshal Mikhail Tukhachevsky's reflections on the impact of motorization and air power had led him to come out firmly in favor of mass, mechanized forces able to conduct deep operations in a war of annihilation. His opponents were castigated for not only poor strategy but for poor theory, which was much more dangerous. This helped seal the fate of many in Stalin's purges, although it did not spare Tukhachevsky a similar fate. After the war, the initial Soviet focus had been on the impact of thermonuclear weapons, which led to a reduced conventional army, but by the late 1960s the numbers were rising again. Reflecting the view that the best chance of victory was early in a war, before American reserves could get across the Atlantic to Europe, the General Staff stressed the importance of being able to mount maneuvers deep in NATO territory with minimal prior mobilization, maximum surprise, and combined forces. This tradition, as reflected in the military doctrines of the Warsaw Pact, was another reason for NATO countries, led by the United States, to get on the same wavelength. Luttwak encouraged the view that attrition based on firepower and maneuver based on movement were almost polar opposites. Attrition was presented as not so much a regrettable response to a challenging predicament, but a deliberate choice reflecting a particular mindset. For Luttwak, it involved in, quote, exaggerated dependence on firepower as such to the detriment of maneuver and flexibility, quote. This style, he acknowledged, had the great attractions of predictability and functional simplicity. All military effort could be geared to attacking sets of targets in a systematic fashion. Under its misleading aura, war would be, quote, governed by logic, analogous to that of microeconomics, end quote. The conduct of warfare at all levels would be analogous to the management of a profit-maximizing industrial enterprise. In the end, superior resources should win, even though applied with routine and repetitive tactics and procedures. The greater the input, the greater the output. The cost would lie in absorbing the enemy's reciprocal attrition, and the calculation could be upended should the enemy attract an ally to achieve a superior balance of power. Against this dull, methodical, bureaucratic linearity, Luttwak promoted imaginative flair and operational paradox. Against traditional science, he sought a maneuver's art. Relational maneuver warfare sought to avoid enemy strength in order to attack enemy weakness. It was, Luttwak suggested, an almost compulsory approach for the resource-weak side. In posing the issue in these terms, Boyd, Luttwak, and their contemporaries were urging a return to military classics of the modern era, but with the postmodern twist resulting from their heightened sensitivity to cognitive processes. On the critical issues of military strategy, the classics offered less clarity than was often supposed, and so the net result was often to update for a new audience the muddle of earlier times. The starting point was inevitably Clausewitz, but as it was well known, On War was not a finished work, and Clausewitz was in the process of revising his ideas at the time of his death. The resultant ambiguity had affected all those who had taken this work as their starting point, and further distortions had arisen in the responses of key figures such as Delbruck and then Liddell Hart to what they believed Clausewitz had said. Complications of language and translation easily added to the confusion, which meant that the return of the classics led to some intense debates about what they really meant, and if that could help sort out the conceptual confusion that was developing around the attempted application of their ideas to contemporary problems. While these debates were gathering steam, an important new English translation of Clausewitz by Peter Perret and Michael Howard was published, and an English edition of Delbruck became available for the first time. Behind all of this, there was one large issue, which was whether there was an alternative to large-scale battle as a route to victory. There was a further and more difficult issue about the meaning and possibility of victory itself. Limited war had been prominent in the 18th century, and there were examples of it from the 19th. If a war was to end without one state subjugating another, there was going to have to be some sort of negotiation. The bargain struck could be assumed to have some relationship to the balance of power at the conclusion of hostilities. Clausewitz had recognized this possibility, but he had not explored it fully. His main focus was the use of battle to eliminate the enemy army as a fighting force and thus render the enemy state helpless. This became known as the strategy of annihilation, a term used by von Moltke and then compared by Delbruck with a strategy of exhaustion. Delbruck saw exhaustion as persuading the enemy to abandon the fight, even though its army had not been annihilated. Exhaustion suggested that the enemy had been worn down to the point that it could not face further war. This was most likely to occur if its survival was not at issue and the stakes were limited and susceptible to compromise. Confusion then entered with regard to method, because there was no reason why exhaustion could not result from a series of inconclusive battles. Delbruck also used the term bipolar strategy to capture the idea of a commander deciding from moment to moment whether to achieve a goal by battle or maneuver.